Well, thank you, Maurice, and thank you, everyone. I hope my mic is working and you can all hear me. It's great to be back in Granbury this evening in this beautiful facility, and I appreciate all of you who have come out and braved the elements on this rainy fall evening. It's great to have the rain, too, but it's not so nice to drive in, isn't it? Well, this evening I'm going to talk to you about a subject that should be very, very important to all of you, and that's the man for whom this town is named. And I don't think I've ever before lectured in any town on the man after whom the town was named. I have lectured on James Birdsey McPherson in his hometown, but it's named Clyde, Ohio. It's not named after him, and what a name. And why won't they change the name to McPherson? It'd be better. But anyway, it's a privilege to be able to talk to you on a subject like this. Of course, talking about a subject like this, and talking about the Civil War, as I said last time, there have been so many books written about the Civil War. There were so many letters and so many diaries. We're always finding out more. And that makes being a Civil War historian interesting, because there are always more things to find out that you didn't know before. And it also makes a Civil War historian, if he's smart, stay humble, because there's always somebody that knows something that I don't know. I happen to know, for example, right now, one of my former graduate students, now a PhD and a professor at the Tarrant County College, has been for a while working on bringing out an edited edition of the letters of a guy named Kleber Van Zandt, who was very close to Granbury and actually was instrumental in bringing the remains of General Granbury back here to the town of Granbury. So there's always new things being discovered. We find Kleber Van Zandt's letters, we find his wife's letters, we find out all sorts of new things, and always learning, and that's an exciting way to be. Now, last time I was here, I told you the story of General Hood, after whom this county is named. And the story of General Granbury is similar in certain ways, but it's different in some key ways. I think one big way that it's different is that General Hood rose high enough. It rose to a high enough level of responsibility that he was able to make decisions that might be mistakes and might cause people to criticize him. And people did criticize General Hood. And when you're at that level of responsibility, sometimes you don't make a mistake, but things just don't turn out right, and people criticize you anyway. Now, General Granbury was at a lower level of responsibility for a number of reasons, and I'll talk about those. It wasn't really any fault of his, but he was at a lower level of responsibility. And because of that, he didn't have to make the same kinds of decisions that General Hood did, and some of the mistakes that General Hood either made or got blamed for making, Granbury really never had an opportunity to make that kind of mistake. His job was primarily leadership, and he did a good job of it. And I don't know really of anyone who criticizes Hiram Granbury. I don't know of any criticisms of him. He's not controversial like John Bell Hood. The story of General Granbury is also an interesting story. It's got romance, more so than General Hood, but it's also got some sadness too. Well, Hiram Bronson Granbury was born in Copiah County, Mississippi on March 1st, 1831. His father was Norval Granbury, and his mother was Nancy McLaurin Granbury, and his father was a Baptist pastor and also had a farm. And when little Hiram was about 4 or 5 years old, just a little boy, his father sold the place in Copiah County and moved a little ways north into the next county to the north of there to Hinds County, Mississippi. And he settled on a farm between Raymond and Palestine, Mississippi. Interestingly enough, about 6 or 7 miles from what would become the Civil War battlefield of Raymond, Mississippi, which will show up in this story later. Well, that's where Hiram Granbury grew up. And he got his education at a little college in Mississippi. It was a Presbyterian college. His dad was a Baptist pastor, but Hiram went, and probably with his dad's blessing, to a Presbyterian college that was a little bit southeast of where the Granburys lived, and it was called Oakland College. And it was quite a respected little Presbyterian college in that area at that time. And it existed for about 40 years. And then in the 1870s, of course long after General Granbury was dead, Oakland College closed. And what's interesting about that is its property was then bought by the state of Mississippi and was later turned into a college that the state of Mississippi set up. It was a state college, became a state university. It's now known as Alcorn State University in Mississippi. Now, of course, it's not the same institution, and they've built many buildings since that day, but I guess they still have an old chapel from the old Oakland College. So Granbury studied there at Oakland College, and then sometime after his 21st birthday, he changed a couple of things. He went out to Texas and changed his name. Now that sounds bad. You know how the reputation of folks going to Texas and changing their names and what might lead them to do that. And now I can't be too hard on folks that moved to Texas, but I will say I never changed my name when I came here. It's not exactly like it sounds. It's not as if he changed his name to something totally different. You see, Granbury's father and Granbury's family, his brothers and sisters, and everybody around there, his uncle there in Mississippi, all spelled his name, you know, Granberry, Granbury. And sometime around when Granbury turned 21, Hiram Granbury turned 21, he changed the spelling of his last name to the spelling that we now know today for this town, Granbury, Granbury. And nobody really seems to know why he did that. And even his family didn't know. They just said he insisted on it. That was just a notion that he took, that he should spell it that way. And I don't really know why he did that. And I'll just suggest a possibility. I think Granbury, that spelling, is closer to the etymological origins of the name, which is supposed to be crane fort, like the fort where cranes, the birds, cranes, live. And that's where it came from, I guess, in the old English or Norse or something. And think of the word for bury that you find in a lot of English names, similar to burg. So maybe burg with a U, meaning fort or fortress or castle or something like that. And I don't know if he got all that education at Oakland College and decided he was going to correct the spelling of his name or not. Another possibility, though, is people just were not as uptight about spelling as they are today. You know, over the years, it has really bothered me, especially about my third grade teacher, and I've never really got over how uptight she was about spelling. The poor lady could think of only one way to spell any given word. And she'd have this test, and I would offer up what I thought were perfectly reasonable ways. You know, one of my favorite presidents, Andrew Jackson, once said, "I have pity on a man who can think of only one way to spell a word." I don't have that problem at all. But anyway, my wife, by the way, is an excellent speller. I've tried to convince her that spelling ability is inversely proportional to intelligence, but she's not buying it. I don't suppose too many other people are either. Well, anyway, he changed the spelling of his last name and he moved to Texas. And he settled first in Seguin, Texas, and tried practicing law down there, but that didn't seem to prosper for him very well. So he moved up to McLennan County, and that's where he kind of hung out his shingle successfully and began to practice law. And he was quite successful at practicing law there. He became, from 1856 to 1858, the Chief Justice of McLennan County. So that was a pretty honorable position for a young man who at that time, in 1856, was only 25 years old. Of course, people got on faster in life in those days. They didn't necessarily live as long always, and they were aggressive, and he got on quick in life. So he was a successful lawyer there and a successful judge in McLennan County when, in 1858, he married Fanny Sims. Now, Fanny Sims lived there in Waco, there in McLennan County. And we don't really know how long she lived in Waco. We do know that she was born in Alabama. And we know that her father still apparently lived in Tuscaloosa, Alabama at this time, and continued to live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama for some years after that. And as we'll see later in the story, that comes up. So how Fanny got out there to Waco, we don't know. It may have been for whatever reason, we just don't know. But anyway, she married Hiram Granbury, and she was born in 1838. So in the year that they got married, she was just 20 years old, and probably just had turned 20 just a month or two before. And the accounts, I've not been able to find any picture of Fanny Sims Granbury, but the accounts say that she was very pretty. Now, my wife says that all brides are very pretty, and I suppose she must be right. I wouldn't contradict her on a thing like that. But Fanny Sims Granbury was said to be very pretty, but I've not been able to find any pictures of her. And there's really kind of limited knowledge that we have about her, but I'll get to some things we do know about her a little later. Anyway, Hiram and Fanny never had any children. And there may have been there was a reason for that, apparently, that possibly already at that time, Fanny may already have begun to have health problems that ultimately led to her death only 5 years later, actually just a couple of weeks shy of their 5th anniversary. And she died ultimately, as we now know, of ovarian cancer. So one has to wonder if some workings of that were not already beginning to have an effect, even not long after the wedding, and that they were not able to have children. At any rate, they continued to live there in Waco until 1861, and the Civil War broke out. On February 1st, 1861, the state of Texas seceded, and then it became clear that the Lincoln administration would not accept secession, and so then war came. And Hiram Granbury did what a lot of prominent men in towns all across the South and all across the North and all through the country did. This was a very common pattern for how armies were raised. And that is, he raised a company of troops, called them the Waco Guards. And all these companies had names. And usually a prominent local man would raise that company. A company was 100 men, and typically a company came from one town. And they would be often guys who'd grown up together in that town. Often the ladies of the town would have a ceremony. The ladies of the town would sew flags for them to take off to war as battle flags, and they would have a ceremony presenting those flags to them. I'm not sure if they did that for the Waco Guards, but they probably did. At any rate, the local leader who raised them would then become their captain. And so Hiram Granbury became the captain of the Waco Guards. And you might be wondering, well, what was his military background? Well, as far as we know, none. But that wasn't so unusual. There were a couple of reasons why at that time that was pretty common. First of all, there was the way people thought about military leadership. People did not view the military, well, they really didn't view professions as professions in the sense that we do today. Look at how quickly Hiram Granbury begins practicing law. He goes to a college, he shows up in Texas, he hangs out his shingle, he practices law. And he did study some law when he was here, but the point is, it was less, professionalism was less viewed and valued than it is today. Same with the military. And there was an idea that that what you need for a military officer is a natural leader of men. And therefore, if you have natural leadership in other areas, you must be a good military leader too. And that actually worked out okay in a lot of cases at this level, at the level of a company, a captain of a company like Hiram Granbury, and even a little bit higher up. Now, when you get a lot higher up, sometimes that didn't work so well. And we can point to some generals in the Civil War who didn't do very well, where know-how and expertise and training really, really counted for something. But anyway, people viewed Hiram Granbury as a leader. He was a local leader. By the way, he was 6 feet 2 inches tall in a time when the average man was about 5'6.5" or 5'7". So here's a man who's about 7 inches taller than the average man. And at 6'2", he weighed 160 pounds. It's fairly thin. Now they tended to be pretty skinny back there. I don't know if you've ever been to a museum, like you go to the Civil War Museum there in Fort Worth, or White Settlement there on the west side of Fort Worth, and you see those some of those uniforms, some of the clothes that they wore, and you start to imagine trying to get into some of those clothes. That wouldn't be good. It would damage all the seams if I tried to get into those clothes, because they were awfully skinny. And so was Hiram Granbury. And he was very skinny. But anyway, he was viewed as a leader. So he led the Waco Guards, and they went off to one of the theaters of the war. And the particular theater of the war that they went into was the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. That's another thing that makes them different from John Bell Hood, who fought most of his war in Virginia until he was transferred west. So Hiram Granbury fought his entire war in that area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. In Hopkinsville, Kentucky, in the fall of 1861, the Waco Guards and their captain, Hiram Granbury, were incorporated with 9 other companies, as was standard during the Civil War, into a regiment. And that regiment was called the 7th Texas Infantry. And that became one of Texas' proud infantry regiments, and they certainly did well on a number of battlefields throughout the war. Well, the way that they selected officers to be above the company level, the officers who would be at the regimental level, that would be the regimental major, the regimental lieutenant colonel, and the regimental colonel, was that they were elected either by the men of the regiment or by the captains of the 10 companies. However that may have been, they elected Hiram Granbury to be major of the 7th Texas. And so he got his first promotion right there in the fall of '61 and became major of the 7th Texas. Now, Fanny Granbury did not contemplate staying back home in Waco, and who would want to stay in Waco? Sorry. It's just a TCU thing. Anyway, she did not contemplate staying back home in Waco. While Hiram was off fighting the war, she wanted to stay as close to him as she could. And officers' wives could sometimes do that. And so she did. She went to Kentucky with him and would try to get lodgings as close to camp as possible. And if they were in winter quarters and he had some place where she could stay with him, she would stay right with him. So she stuck as close as possible to Hiram. Well, that February, the 7th Texas saw its first combat, and things didn't work well. Remember I said that non-professional people who didn't have any training but were viewed as natural leaders might work well at the company level or the regimental level, but you get to the level of generals and bad things can happen. And this first battle was an example of that. And 2 Confederate generals who didn't have any military background or training to speak of, or any aptitude or talent either, really messed up in the Battle of Fort Donelson. And that battle was fought actually on February 15th of 1862. The Confederates there at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River in Tennessee, and the Cumberland River was a very strategic river. The Confederates there at that fort were more or less surrounded. They were boxed in by the Yankees, and their orders were to hold the place for a few days and buy some time for the Confederacy, and then they were to fight their way out. Well, they launched the attack to fight their way out on the 15th of February, and they were successful. They pushed back the Union lines for a variety of reasons. They were successful in doing that, including hard fighting. And the 7th Texas, of course, did its part and did well. But the 2 top Confederate generals in the fort were both really men who had come right out of civilian life and really did not have any qualifications to be a general. And quite frankly, they just didn't know what they were doing. And they messed up. And they decided after after the way had been pushed open to leave the fort, they decided that they had been so successful in that battle that they didn't need to leave. They could just stay in the fort. They've gotten rid of the Yankees. We took care of that. Sure was a hard war, but we're glad it's over. But anyway, or a battle or whatever. Anyway, of course, you can guess what happened, and that is the Union forces immediately closed back in more strongly than ever and gained a firmer grip on the Confederate position. In fact, gained positions of leverage, which made it clear that the Confederates would not be able to hold out any further there at Fort Donelson. And in fact, now they could neither escape nor continue to hold the fort, and they had to surrender. And so after really winning the fight, most of the fight, there were some areas where the Confederate forces were not successful, but for the most part, enjoying a lot of success. On February 15th, the Confederates surrendered early on the morning of February 16th. It was a strange occurrence. And so Hiram Granbury starts the war. After his first day of combat, he goes into captivity, not because of anything he had done, but because his generals had messed up. Now, the enlisted men from the 7th Texas went to Johnson's Island in Lake Erie, near the site of the Battle of Lake Erie, if you're interested, and near Cedar Point Amusement Park, if you've been up there, that you're not far from Johnson's Island. But the officers were kept elsewhere. Briefly, they were at Camp Douglas in Chicago, and then at Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio. And the Union didn't really know what to do with them. It was the first big batch of prisoners that had been captured in the entire war. And so they were finally shipped to Boston, Massachusetts. And there they were imprisoned in Fort Warren. Fort Warren was located on an island located 6 miles out in Massachusetts Bay, there at Boston. And this is a fort that the federal government maintained for a number of years, a large masonry fort, so it's a major installation. And the Confederate officers were imprisoned there. Now, Fanny had tried to stick as close to Hiram as she could, and she actually came north with him. Now, she wasn't a prisoner of war, but she traveled north with him there. Now, Union authorities were very tolerant about this. It's hard to imagine, it's impossible to imagine a prisoner of war situation being like this today, but General Grant actually specifically authorized Hiram Granbury to be able to be paroled. Now, we don't do that with prisoners of war today, only with desperate criminals. No, we don't do it with prisoners. I don't think that's much smarter, actually, but we don't do it with prisoners of war today where we parole them. So we'll let you loose. You just show up at the POW camp, okay? Because you're a prisoner of war, don't forget. But they did, and he was paroled so he could take care of Fanny and get her settled in some lodgings there in Boston. And he got her settled there in Boston, but there was no way. I mean, they were very tolerant. They let the man's wife come with him. And, I mean, you think they might be worrying that she'd be slipping him hacksaws and who knows what else, but I guess not. But they actually let him kind of run loose to get her settled there in Boston and then turn himself in. But there's no way they're going to let her go out to Fort Warren. I mean, that is just too much. That's a fort. It's just women aren't out there, and that's that. And so she was there in Boston, and he was out there at Fort Warren. Well, while she was living there in Boston during the late winter months, and he was a prisoner of war for about 6 months, about 5-6 months, really. That is all that he was in there. But during that time, Fanny really began to suffer health problems. And we don't know, how much she might have been ailing before this, but now it becomes very obvious and very, very pronounced that she is really not well at all. Now, for years, people said, well, that's because of that northern climate. That's what it was. She was suffering in the northern climate. And that is really very romantic to think she goes there to be near her husband and just kills herself in that northern climate. Well, I got to tell you, sometimes the winters up there aren't a lot of fun, but if you stay indoors and stay dressed, they really won't kill you. I've survived, well, not Boston, but Chicago, and it's got to be worse. So anyway, it wasn't. We know it wasn't the climate. And I admit, you could catch pneumonia there in the winter, and people do get sick, but that's not what it was. It was the ovarian cancer. Now, it's kind of interesting how they figured this out. Fanny was, of course, writing letters to Hiram out there in the fort, you know, and he was getting her letters. Now, Hiram had a cellmate in the cell where he was living, and this man was a medical doctor, actually a civilian medical doctor from Maryland, from Hagerstown, Maryland, but he had been in prison for pro-Confederate activity behind Union lines. So he was in prison for that by this time. And as Hiram would talk to his cellmate there, he shared things that Fanny wrote in her letters about what she was suffering. And the cellmate the doctor kind of diagnosed it. He said something's wrong with her ovaries. He called it ovarian dropsy or something like that. Well, yeah, something's wrong with her ovaries. She had cancer. And so he kind of realized that she had a serious medical problem, that she was really sick. And he seems to have urged Granbury, of course, where's Fanny going to go? It's a long way back to Waco. And in wartime, that would be a very difficult trip to make for a woman by herself. Now, and women didn't do as much by themselves then as they do now. Now, you say, oh, well, a woman can't travel by herself from Boston to Waco. And you think, well, how dare you say that, you sexist? But she could have back then. I mean, it could be done, but it was asking a lot. And she's sick. And, oh yeah, she's 24 years old at that time. So she's not, she's still pretty young. So what the doctor, Granbury's cellmate, suggested was send her down to stay with my wife at our home in Hagerstown, Maryland, which wasn't nearly as far away. It was a lot easier to get to. So, and it was not across Union lines. It was behind Union lines, and yet this would be someone who was sympathetic to the Confederacy, but yet was behind Union lines, and she would be, in that sense, in a kind of a congenial place, an easy to get to place. So that is what she did, and she traveled down there to Hagerstown. But she continued to be sick, and as Granbury continued to get letters from her talking about her symptoms getting worse, and he would share them with the doctor, and the doctor would, what's kind of interesting, in July, the doctor's writing, she needs to be examined. And he's writing to his wife down in Hagerstown, you've got to tell her she's got to be examined. That's the only way she's going to get treatment and get any help. Well, apparently she did agree to be examined, and we get these little bits and pieces of information. Something gets mentioned in a letter. Now, there may be more information out there, and it may come to light sometime. Maybe even some of you know things that I don't. But it seems like, she sort of disappears from sight for a few weeks, and then, oops, here's what's going on. And we find by August, she has seen a physician. She's under the care of a physician, and a highly skilled surgeon in Baltimore was scheduled to operate on her. And we know this because Union authorities actually in mid-August, specially granted parole, again, to Hiram Granbury. He was paroled to go down to Baltimore to be with Fanny for her surgery, which obviously that's very serious. I mean, surgery is serious now, and you can imagine how much more serious it was then. So Hiram was paroled. He got out of Fort Warren, and he never was back in Fort Warren after that. Went down to, that I know of, he wasn't back in there. He went down to be with Fanny. Well, we know she didn't have the operation. We don't know for sure why. The most likely guess, and this is the surmise that everyone makes, is that they found that the cancer was too advanced and that they couldn't operate. Certainly today, that would be the conclusion we would draw with modern medicine. Uh-oh, they can't operate her. And that's always a very bad thing to hear when you're a friend or a loved one and they say, well, we're sorry, it's inoperable. You don't like to hear that at all. And it wasn't good news for sure. She was not doing well, and for whatever reason, they could have had the surgery, and they decided not to. Now, they didn't have a lot of the diagnostic tests machines that we have today, but somehow they were able to see that this is not going to work. So she didn't have the surgery. Well, it seems that before Hiram Granbury could go back up to Fort Warren at Boston, he was formally exchanged. They had an exchange of officers. Hiram Granbury was exchanged for two Yankee lieutenants, one rebel major, and they were swapped. And so Hiram Granbury was once again free to serve in the Confederate Army. He served various duty. He did some recruiting duty, apparently back in Texas, and then traveled around a lot. Again, we see him crop up someplace where he shows up in the records and then kind of submerges, but on various duty. The 7th Texas Regiment, the enlistment of the regiment, were not exchanged until early 1863. And so the regiment really wasn't reconstituted, and Granbury was not back in, as you might say, his regular job until early 1863. And so he was performing various duties on a sort of a detached basis as an officer who didn't really have a command, and so they were using him for different things. He seems to have spent a good deal of time with Fanny, who was getting worse and worse. In early 1863, Granbury was promoted to colonel of the 7th Texas, but things were really getting bad for Fanny. Hiram took Fanny to stay at her parents' house in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to be there. And there she spent the last couple of months of her life. And she died in March 20th, 1863, 11 days short of what would have been their 5th anniversary. So that was really hard on Hiram Granbury to lose his wife, as you can well imagine. It was just a couple of months after Fanny's death that Hiram Granbury and the 7th Texas found themselves once again in action. Spring comes and the military campaigns get going again. And what happened in the spring of 1863 was that Grant began carrying out his successful Vicksburg campaign. He had been trying to get at Vicksburg for a number of months, but you couldn't take the place unless you could get behind it. And finally, Grant struck on a very bold plan to get behind it. Had the Navy's gunboats and the Army's transport riverboats run past Vicksburg and marched his armies around and through the bayous on the west side of the Mississippi River, and then had his troops ferried across to land on the Mississippi shore south of Vicksburg. And then they marched northeast through the interior of Mississippi, heading for Jackson. The idea was that they would neutralize Jackson as a potential base for Confederate operations in central Mississippi. And then Grant and his army would turn west, and they would approach Vicksburg from the rear, the only direction that gave you a chance to take the place. Now, as Grant was marching up towards Jackson, in Jackson itself was a small Confederate garrison consisting primarily of a single brigade of Confederate troops under General John Gregg, and in that brigade was the 7th Texas under Colonel Hiram Granbury. And General Gregg decided that from the information he's getting, and remember, we know where all these units are. We know what well, he's got this many troops and these are who they are, but they don't know that. So they're trying to get just little fragmentary reports. Somebody saw the Yankees here, somebody saw the Yankees there. And General Gregg got the idea that Grant might have separated out a small fragment of his force near the town of Raymond, Mississippi, and that fragment would be very vulnerable to a Confederate attack, and that Gregg's own brigade, which is a large brigade, would be big enough to carry that out. And so he set out to do that, and he struck the Union forces just west of the town of Raymond, Mississippi, in the valley of 14 Mile Creek. And he had a plan. The 7th Texas would strike the head of the Union column head on, stop them, and hold them up, and then the rest of the brigade would swing around their flank and hit the flank of the Union forces. And so they implemented that. Well, the problem was, this was not a small fragment, this was the entire 17th Army Corps under General James Birdsey McPherson. And they were stretched out in a long column along the road. It was a very hot day, it was very dusty, and the individual brigades did not like to march right behind each other, so they left good-sized gaps between the brigades. And that gave the Confederates a little bit of an advantage, because they were able to hit that lead brigade and take it by surprise and kind of drive it back. But as soon as General McPherson was able to bring up the rest of his corps, of course, the numerical disparity was enormous. The 7th Texas fought a very tough battle there along the valley, right there along 14-Mile Creek itself. And as I mentioned before, this battle is only 6 or 7 miles from the farm where Hiram Granbury grew up. But of course, although the 7th Texas fought very hard and very tough, and they were able to stop the lead Union elements, there was no way they were going to be able to hold. It's ridiculous to think of a single regiment holding up an entire corps, which would outnumber it many times over. And when General Gregg realized what was going on and what he was up against, he called off the attack and ordered a retreat. And so the 7th Texas and the rest of Gregg's brigade retreated after what came to be known as the Battle of Raymond, Mississippi. That was on May 12th, 1863. 2 days later, Grant's forces arrived outside Jackson. Now, some additional Confederate forces had joined Gregg's brigade, and another Confederate general, a very high-ranking Confederate general, General Joseph Johnston, had arrived there in Jackson. But they still didn't really have enough strength to hold the city. And so after some fighting there on May 14th in what came to be called the Battle of Jackson, again the Confederates had to retreat. And that really ended Hiram Granbury's participation in the Vicksburg campaign. Because what General Johnston did then was to pull his forces back out to the northeast of Jackson and just kind of hover out there and watch, and not really do anything else. And since Granbury was under orders, I mean, he had to do what he was ordered to do. His unit wound up just sitting out there and really didn't get a crack at the Yankees during the rest of the Vicksburg campaign. So on July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg fell. And after that, the action picked up again in Tennessee. And Granbury and his 7th Texas Regiment were transferred to the Army of Tennessee. Now, I know this gets confusing because the Union Army that took Vicksburg was called the Army of the Tennessee. The Union armies were usually named after rivers. And the Confederate Army to which Granbury and his regiment are now transferred is the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Confederate armies were usually named after states. Now, in the Army of the Tennessee, Granbury's 7th Texas Regiment was put together with several other Texas regiments to form a solid Texas brigade. In the Confederate Army, they usually liked to form solid state brigades if they could, or nearly solid Texas brigades. Sometimes they had a Louisiana regiment serving with them. But mostly, just like the Hood's Texas Brigade would often include a regiment either from Arkansas or from Georgia, and they would keep those Texas regiments constant. So this Texas Brigade, now Granbury wasn't commander of this Texas Brigade yet, but this is the brigade that will later come to be known as Granbury's Texas Brigade, and will be famous as Granbury's Texas Brigade, the second most famous Texas Brigade in the war after Hood's Brigade. Well, now Granbury's was this new brigade in a new army, and they get into battle again at Chickamauga in northeast Georgia on September 19th and 20th, 1863. And again, the brigade fights well, but the battle is really indecisive. It's a Confederate victory, and yet it doesn't bring them all that much. Then, in November of '63, Granbury played a much more important role in the Battle of Chattanooga. After the Battle of Chickamauga, Union forces fell back just a few miles, 5 or 6 miles, back to the city of Chattanooga. And Confederate forces took up positions on the high ground overlooking Chattanooga. And they sort of had them semi-besieged there for a while. The Union responded to that by transferring more troops to Chattanooga to reinforce the Union forces there, and by sending Ulysses Grant, the Union's best general, to command them. Grant launched his offensive in late November of '63, and that leads to the Battle of Chattanooga. Now, in the Battle of Chattanooga, Granbury's brigade, which was then, it was John A. Smith's brigade, John A. Smith was the brigade commander, the brigade of which the 7th Texas was a part, was stationed, was part of Cleburne's division. And Cleburne's division was on the extreme right of the Confederate line. And Granbury's brigade, Smith's brigade, of which Granbury was a part, was on the extreme right of Cleburne's division. So it's kind of like, you know, Joshua Chamberlain and We Are the Flank and all that. They were the flank. And they had a position there on Missionary Ridge. Now, Granbury has had some bad experiences in this war where he's fought well and done pretty good, but they haven't gotten a victory out of it because of bad generalship, right? Fort Donelson, the generals really let him down. Raymond, I don't blame General Gregg, but he didn't know what he didn't know. Johnston did not let him get into the fight very much there in the Vicksburg campaign. But now, Granbury has a really, really good general over him, and that's General Cleburne. Now, General Cleburne, by the way, his name is spelled exactly like the town of Cleburne, Texas, which is named after him, but he pronounced his name Cleburne. And General Patrick Cleburne was the best division commander in the Confederate Army. He was very, very good. And at Chattanooga, he positioned Smith's brigade, of which Granbury was a part. He positioned them very wisely. It would have been tempting to put them right on the very end of Missionary Ridge. After all, it's a high ridge. It's several hundred feet high. Position them right on the end of it. The Yankees will have to climb up to you several hundred feet. The trouble was the slopes of the ridge were too steep to be covered by rifle fire from men on the top. A man at the top of the ridge, if he wants to shoot someone coming up, is going to have to rear way up and be a great target. And Cleburne realized that this ridge was shaped different than other ridges in the war. It was steeper and it was higher, and it had a narrow top. And so Granbury knew what to do with it. So he put his line on a little hump of the ridge. The top of the ridges aren't smooth on top, and the top of the ridge sort of has these humps and dips and humps and dips. He basically took the first hump up the ridge and took that position. So Union troops that got up on the ridge had to attack right along the crest of the ridge. If they tried to come at Cleburne's position, Granbury's position, from the sides, they'd be way down the slopes and they'd really be out of the fight. But if they tried to come at him from near his level, up on the crest of the ridge, it'd be like attacking someone, like coming at someone down a narrow hallway. They just had this narrow corridor where only a single regiment, or maybe a brigade, could charge at one time. And it gave Cleburne's men, Smith's men, Granbury's men, all the advantages. And so they were very successful. In fact, it was about the only successful thing that happened for the Confederacy at the Battle of Chattanooga. Oops. Even if you have a good division commander, it can still get messed up at the Army level, and it did. Everything else for the Confederates totally went to pieces at Chattanooga. It was a disaster. The Union forces broke the Confederate line at a number of places there on Missionary Ridge, but not where Cleburne's division was, not where Granbury's brigade was. And so Cleburne's division, including Granbury's brigade, did a very good job of holding their position and then covering the Confederate defeat, keeping the Union forces from falling on the backs of the retreating Confederate Army. Then the next day, Cleburne's division was assigned to hold Ringgold Gap. Again, kind of a rear guard thing. Keep the Yankees off us while we get away with our supplies and stuff, and while we regroup. And again, Cleburne's division did a very good job. And again, the Texas Brigade within Cleburne's division did a very good job. Only there's a difference. General John A. Smith has been wounded at Chattanooga. So the brigade has a new commander, and that's Hiram Granbury. Colonel Granbury is now commanding the Texas Brigade, which will come to be called Granbury's Texas Brigade, and will continue to be called Granbury's Texas Brigade, even when Hiram Granbury is no longer its commander. So Granbury's Texas Brigade now has its commander, and it's doing very well, and it's establishing itself as one of the premier units in the premier division of the Army of Tennessee. Well, the fighting there at Chattanooga ended the fighting in 1863. In 1864, what follows is the Atlanta campaign. Union forces under General William Sherman start out from the vicinity of Chattanooga, and they fight their way about 100 miles through northwest Georgia all the way down to Atlanta, with Joe Johnston's Confederate Army at least skirmishing with them and occasionally fighting with them all the way. There were a number of small battles. The Battle of New Hope Church, which is about halfway between Chattanooga and Atlanta, was one in which Granbury's Texas Brigade especially distinguished itself by good performance, turned in another sterling performance, another highlight reel, we might say, if they took highlights of that kind of thing. So did very well indeed. Well, despite all this, and despite much hard fighting by Granbury's brigade at other locations, including in the Battle of Atlanta, nevertheless, the city fell on September 1st, 1864. And this leads us then to the final chapter of Granbury's Confederate career. The fall of Atlanta was almost the last disaster for the Confederacy in terms of chances of winning the war, realistic chances of winning the war. In a sense, if you look at the disasters, the heavy blows that hit the Confederacy, in a sense, now there were other things that happened that cost more lives, but in terms of really reducing its chances of winning the war, Granbury was there for both of them. He wasn't at fault. He did great, and everybody agreed he had performed well. But Fort Donelson was the first real disaster that really hurt the Confederacy's chances of winning the war. And Atlanta was the last. Now, why does that hurt their chances of winning the war? Because holding Atlanta was about the only thing the Confederates could have done that might have discouraged the Northern voters enough that in November of '64, they would not have reelected Lincoln. And it's possible, it's not a guarantee, and historians argue about whether it would have happened or not, but it is at least possible, and it certainly was the Confederacy's best chance by the fall of '64, possible that if the Democratic candidate had been elected in November of '64, he might have stopped the fighting and opened negotiations. There might have been some chance for the Confederacy to win its independence. But with the fall of Atlanta, Union morale shot way up. We might say Lincoln's approval ratings went way up. In mid-August, Lincoln, by the way, did not think he would be reelected. There were no polls in those days. He just sort of had to talk to newspaper editors and try to get a grasp of how you were doing. And in August, Lincoln himself thought he would not be reelected. Historians argue about whether that was valid or not. But anyway, 1st of September, Atlanta falls, and it's pretty much guaranteed. Now, what's that got to do with Granbury and the rest of his life? Because that is hugely important for what happens next. What do you do after you've lost the war? Well, you could give up, but of course that's asking a lot. That's asking that you really know something that we know in hindsight, but it'd be very hard for someone to know at the time. Very hard to maybe impossible. I don't know whether it was possible or not. But you know, there's going to be a tendency to think somehow we'll pull it out. And you could look back in history and you could think of many causes that seemed lost and people went on fighting for them. And so General Hood is going to go on fighting, and he's going to try to do increasingly desperate things. And this is going to put us on the road to Franklin, Tennessee. Hood tries various tricks, not too bad, actually tries a number of pretty clever moves after the fall of Atlanta to try to threaten Sherman's line of supplies. Armies normally have to have a line of supplies. Sherman's going to show how there can be an exception to that rule. But Hood tried a number of clever tricks to do that, operating out of bases in North Alabama. And he felt like that wasn't really getting him anywhere. And so he decided he needed to do something bolder. And much as a football team, when it's desperate and they're down to the last few ticks of the clock, they will try that so-called Hail Mary pass, that desperate play that has a very low percentage chance of working, but maybe somehow victory will be snatched out of the jaws of defeat. So Hood decides to march north into Tennessee, and he marches from central Alabama north into Tennessee. And they're headed for Nashville, and kind of just to see what turns up, to see what kind of opportunities they can seize. At Spring Hill, Tennessee, and I mentioned this in my last lecture to you all, they just barely missed a chance to trap a large segment of the Union Army. It was a kind of a sub-army, so to speak, under General John Schofield. And they almost trapped it there. Now, again, historians argue about a lot of things, and we go along and say it was definitely this way or it was definitely that way. But I can tell you, you can find some historian will come along and say, no, it wasn't. It wasn't either. And that's how it is with this, too. Some historians say, well, they weren't that close to trapping them. And even if they had trapped them, that wouldn't necessarily have won the war. Well, it wouldn't necessarily have won the war. In fact, it's really questionable what Hood could have done. I mean, think of any possible outcome to that campaign. And this is one of the things that makes the campaign so tragic and so poignant. It's just hard. Start imagining things. What could Hood have done? I mean, without using a hydrogen bomb or anything. What could he have done that could have changed the outcome of the war? And it's really hard to see. You can tell he's trying a real desperate move, but how could it have won the war? Anyway, after the Yankees got away at Spring Hill, Hood seemed to be angry. Although some deny that he was. Hood seemed to chew out General Claiborne for not doing his job in trapping the Yankees at Spring Hill, although some deny that he did that. I went over that last time. They marched north that day, November 30th, and they came up where the Yankees had dug themselves in around the town of Franklin, Tennessee. The bridge was out on the Harpeth River behind the Union force there. And General Schofield just wanted time. He wanted a few hours for his engineers to repair the bridge over the Harpeth River so he could get his army out of there safely. And there were several hours of daylight left. Now it was dark. He could do it in the dark. But there was daylight left. So he's going to have to take up a defensive position. He's got a few things going for him, though. One is that there had been warfare in Middle Tennessee throughout much of the war. In many places, there had been strong entrenchments dug already, defensive positions already dug, embankments, breastworks already built, and Franklin was one of them. And so Schofield's men had a ready-made defensive position there with trenches and breastworks already ready for them that they could get into. Some of Schofield's men were carrying newer weapons, things like Spencer repeating rifles or Henry repeating rifles, which would be like a lever-action rifle that had a 17-round magazine. And so they could deliver a lot of firepower. Well, they took up the position there. Hood came into position and came up to a Winstead Hill from which he could view across an open plain about more than a mile wide, view the Union lines across there in front of Franklin. And Hood decided that the thing to do was to attack straight ahead across that mile or two of open ground at the Union lines. Now we hear, what, 2 miles of open ground? Well, whether it was 1 mile or 2 miles didn't really matter very much. Either way, it's enough for them to see the Confederate attack coming and have plenty of time to react. But they won't be able to really start killing Confederates in large numbers until they get down to 400 yards. The killing's going to happen inside 400 yards, really, range. It's not a lot of people are going to be killed beyond that range. But it was a long, open area of open fields that they crossed. But Hood decided that they would attack immediately. They wouldn't wait for their artillery to come up. They would attack without the artillery. Now, again, people have speculated over the years and said, well, Hood did that to punish the Army of Tennessee for not trapping, not really carrying through on his orders as he understood it, to trap Schofield the night before. Or he thought that they had become reluctant to launch attacks and too respectful of enemy entrenchments, or because he was just mad. And like I said last time, I think if I were writing Jefferson Davis and his generals again, I don't even think I would try to figure out what Hood's motivation was. It just seemed like the thing to do. And he thought maybe that's how they would win. Maybe they had Schofield trapped. Maybe if they could break his lines and trap him against the Harpeth River, they could remove a significant portion of Thomas's army. At any rate, Hood ordered the attack. Claiborne's division was right in the heart of the attack, moving right up the Columbia Pike, and right in the center of it was Hiram Granbury. We don't know exactly what happened to Granbury. We know Claiborne had a horse shot out from under. We got another one, and I think that was shot out from him. And then Claiborne was advancing on foot when he was last seen. And with most of these generals, we have just a few vignettes of he was seen doing this in the battle, he was seen over there doing that, and then we have where his body was found. Hiram Granbury's body was found in front of the Union lines, close in front of the Union lines. Apparently got up pretty close to the Union lines there in the Confederate center. Claiborne's body was found not far away, and in fact, in all, 6 Confederate generals were killed in the big attack there at Franklin. So it was a devastating attack for the Confederate Army, and Hood's army really was broken by this attack there at Franklin. They still had, they took maybe 30,000 men into battle and lost only a few thousand of them, so they still had a good 25,000 men left, but they had just lost too much good leadership. And that was certainly the case with Granbury's brigade. I know it's going to surprise you that a bunch of young male Texans were this way, but they were kind of rowdy. And they could tend to be unruly. And without the strong leadership of Hiram Granbury, and I think with a lot of discouragement, they were not in a very happy frame of mind, as you can imagine, after this. They could still be pretty hard fighters from time to time, but they really became a difficult thing for the Confederate command to deal with, because they just were lacking that leadership that they needed. Of course, Claiborne's loss was a severe blow, and so was the loss of the other 4 Confederate generals. The next day, during that night, Schofield did what he had wanted to do the whole time. Took his army across the bridge over the Harpeth River and continued his march back to Nashville, which is what he had orders to do, and what he would have done if Hood's men had left him alone and not lost those terrible losses that day. The Confederates were left in control of the battlefield, and so they found these bodies the next day. The bodies of 4 of the Confederate generals who died there at Franklin were laid out on the back porch of the stately plantation house of Carnton, and you can still go and see, and maybe some of you have gone and visited Carnton Plantation House there near Franklin. They're on the back porch. They had a wide veranda, a wide back porch there. Generals Claiborne, Granbury, General John Adams, not the president, but a Confederate general of that name, and General Otho Strahl of Tennessee. All 4 generals, 4 of the 6 generals killed in the battle were laid out there on the back porch, along with several other Confederate officers. We know that Granbury was buried temporarily there near Nashville, probably right there within sight of the Carnton mansion. This I don't know for sure, but I know he was buried temporarily near Franklin, and the place where Confederates were buried near Franklin was actually 2 acres of ground which the McGavock family, which lived there in the Carnton mansion, made available for the burial of Confederate troops there. About 1,500 were killed outright on the field of battle. And so they have that, and you can still go and see there by the Carnton mansion today, McGavock Cemetery, Confederate cemetery there. So my guess is, I know he was buried near Franklin. My guess is probably somewhere within the Carntons or the McGavock Cemetery. He did not remain there very long. Granbury, like Claiborne, was disinterred and moved about 30 miles south to the churchyard of St. John's Episcopal Church. St. John's Episcopal Church had been built and under the auspices of and had been dedicated by Episcopal Bishop Leonidas Polk, Episcopal Bishop who later became a Confederate general and who died in the summer of '64. And as the army had been on the way north, when they passed St. John's Episcopal Church, Patrick Claiborne, Granbury's division commander, had looked at the church. It's quite a pretty brick building. It's okay looking. But Granbury really liked it. It was just, it was a beautiful day and a beautiful setting, and he said, that building is so beautiful, it would almost be worth dying to be buried outside this building. And so that's where Granbury was buried. And, where Claiborne was buried. It was Claiborne who said that. I don't know if I said Granbury. It was Claiborne who said that. Claiborne was buried there. Granbury was buried there, and several other Confederates were buried there as well. They're outside St. John's Episcopal Church, and you can still go and see that today, too. But Granbury didn't stay there permanently. 29 years. His former associate and fellow officer, colleague from Fort Worth, Kleber Van Zandt, decided that Granbury should be moved to rest in the town that bore his name. And so on November 30th, 1893, the 29th anniversary of his death, Granbury was brought to Granbury and was buried in Granbury Cemetery, where he is today. Interestingly enough, the headstone was brought with him. The same headstone that he had at St. John's Episcopal Church was brought with him, and that headstone spelled his last name Granberry. And that headstone marked Granbury's grave here in Granbury, which, by the way, I understand the town in its early days was spelled in various, all mutually satisfactory ways. But at any rate, they eventually have replaced that now with a marker that spells it like the name of the town. And speaking of grave markers, Fanny Sims Granbury's grave marker her grave was unmarked for many years. She was buried in Magnolia Cemetery. We know that. She was buried in Magnolia Cemetery in Mobile, Alabama. She had apparently been brought down to Mobile in search of more medical care late in her life, right before the end. She died, and she was buried there, but in an unmarked grave. And up through the early 2000s, up to like as of 2001, it was my understanding that not only was her grave unmarked, it was unknown. It was not known where Fanny Sims Granbury was buried. Now, as I was researching this talk, I found, somewhat to my surprise, on Find a Grave, that wonderful website, Find a Grave, I found a photograph of Fanny Sims Granbury's gravestone. They have a gravestone. Now, it's obviously a new gravestone. I think it was put there since 2001. So somebody at least believes that they found the grave of Fanny Sims Granbury and now have marked it. And findagrave.com says it is in Magnolia Cemetery in Mobile, Alabama, and that there is a tombstone over there. And you're saying, is that the same Fanny Sims Granbury? It's Fanny Sims Granbury, wife of General Hiram B. Granbury, So yeah, it's the same one. It claims to be. Now, I don't know the story behind it. Apparently someone did some really good detective work. Maybe some of you all know about that. But that was kind of a surprise to me. That's kind of neat. And of course, Granbury continues to be commemorated right here, and there's a statue on the other side of the courthouse that reminds us of him. And a general who didn't rise to the same heights as Hood. Hood had been trained as an officer, was an officer before the war. Granbury came up, as it were, not quite all the way through the ranks, but from the rank of captain, but who really never had anyone find fault with him. I don't know of any criticisms of Granbury. Hood might be controversial, but Granbury is pretty much universally recognized as an extremely good leader and a man who really never put a foot wrong as a leader and as a general, and someone who's lost hurt the Confederacy very much. Well, thank you for your attention.